Look at any modern military air force and you'll find an incredible array of specialized aircraft. Each has been designed to fill a specific role. There are planes to jam radar, planes for command and control, planes to haul cargo, and planes that fuel other planes. This diversification of duties and specialization of skills did not arise overnight. Rather, it resulted from decades of trial and error. The pivotal event in the development of the modern Air Force was the Second World War. During that conflict, military aviation grew out of the realm of speculation and hypothesis. Experience is a harsh teacher, and the lessons of the war were many. Most important was the understanding that flexibility is the crucial element in any air force. Modern warfare demands many missions of air power. A force made up of easily interchangeable component parts has a tremendous advantage. Those parts can be assembled to form whatever sort of force is necessary for a given mission. War drives technological advancement. Once the first shot is fired, money and manpower used elsewhere in peacetime pour into military research and development. Those technological advances in turn dictate changes in strategy and tactics. Never was this more true than with aviation during World War II. The opening actions of the war saw military leaders struggling to match strategic and tactical doctrine with the latest advances in aviation technology. Ultimately, the war fell in favor of those who adapted most quickly. War produces an atmosphere of desperate creativity as men struggle to find some small advantage. What seems obvious to us today took years of hard trial and error to learn. Tens of thousands of brave flyers died between 1939 and 1945, many lost as a result of mistakes that wouldn't be made today. World War II was the most fertile period in aviation history. From the development of new technologies to the evolution of tactics, the men who fought wrought incredible changes. They fulfilled the potential of aircraft and left behind war as we know it today. The seeds of modern military aviation were planted during World War I and left to germinate and bloom during the interwar years. Military aviation started in support of the Army. Reconnaissance planes flying over enemy territory brought back information unprecedented in its depth and accuracy. Before aircraft, whole armies could shift location and the enemy might be none the wiser. After aircraft, that kind of sudden disappearance of a large force was nearly impossible. Gradually, the pilots and their crews started arming their aircraft. The armament was informal at first, hand grenades for ground attack and dueling pistols for dogfighting. But soon specialized weapons were developed and the era of true air battle began. Air-to-air combat came of age very quickly. The biplane fighter aces captured the public's imagination. They were romantic figures, dashing young men flying alone into the clouds to do battle for their country's honor. They achieved a kind of celebrity unavailable to even the most heroic infantrymen. America's first ace of aces was Eddie Rickenbacker, He flew with the Lafayette Escadrille, a group of jaunty aviators that was the first American presence in the war. Germany's greatest and most notorious ace was the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, leader of the infamous Flying Circus. Along with Richthofen, the squadron featured an ambitious young pilot named Hermann Goering. The aces squared off high over the battlefield, trying to push each other back so that the other side wouldn't have a good view of troop movements below. Thus was the concept of air superiority born. In 1917, air superiority became a different issue altogether. Germany, increasingly desperate, used Gotha bombers to drop explosives on civilian areas of Britain. Germany hoped that, with death and destruction a part of daily life in London, the British would lose their will to fight. The Kaiser's Air Force was nearly unassailable. When the bombers flew en masse, the light British fighters of the time couldn't get close enough to inflict significant damage. The raids eventually killed more than 1,000 civilians on the ground. British morale plummeted, and those in the halls of power were terrified that the bombing might break the public will to fight. Britain's best hope seemed to be striking back. Prime Minister Lloyd George established the Royal Air Force as an independent entity to launch a strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The war ended, however, before the unproved bombing force could be tested in battle. Still, the image of the invincible bomber was burned into military imaginations. Between the wars, military planners focused much of their theorizing on strategic bombing. The post-war period was, in many ways, the first golden age of aviation. New technologies rapidly improved the speed, altitude, and range of aircraft. That, in turn, challenged aviation orthodoxy around the world. The RAF's commander, Sir Hugh Trenchard, grew convinced that air power would render armies and navies superfluous. He believed that bombers could eliminate an enemy's ability and will to wage war by striking deep into enemy territory, destroying factories, and terrorizing civilians. Outside his small group of acolytes, Trenchard had few friends in Britain's military bureaucracy. The Army and Navy didn't appreciate Trenchard's belief that they were no longer relevant. They also resented his insistence that the new Air Force be totally independent from the existing armed services. Unfortunately for Trenchard, the Army and Navy had more friends in Parliament than he did. He had to fight continually for funding, elaborating on a vision of warfare that terrified the general public. Bombing civilian populations seemed barbaric. Most in Britain wanted nothing to do with it. Trenchard's one significant ally was Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. In a speech on November 10, 1932, Baldwin reminded the British that whether they had bombers of their own or not, the enemy certainly would. I think, he told Parliament, that it is well for the man on the street to realize that there is no power on earth that can protect him from being bombed. The bomber will always get through. Between them, Trenchard and Baldwin had made air war Britain's greatest horror. They also made it her greatest hope. A similar debate raged in the United States. Lieutenant General Billy Mitchell, America's foremost proponent of air power, also lobbied for the establishment of an independent air force. No diplomat, he would buttonhole anyone who would listen, asserting ad nauseum that with a big enough bomb, a plane could destroy any target. Like Trenchard, Mitchell believed that the Air Force would eventually eliminate the need for armies and navies. and that it would never be able to reach this destiny from under the thumb of those it would eventually eclipse. For all of Mitchell's abrasiveness, he made progress. Though the Air Corps remained a part of the Army, it also filled with passionate believers in the power of strategic bombing. One was General Henry Hap Arnold, who had been put in charge of the Air Corps. In July 1941, Arnold's Air War Plans Department produced AWPD-1, the Corps' plan to defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan. In it, the Air Corps gave itself a high degree of autonomy. No longer would their mission be dictated by the Army, which saw them as little more than flying artillery. Instead, it would move according to the visions of Trenchard and Mitchell. AWPD-1's centerpiece was a strategic bombing campaign against German industrial sites. The plan was incredibly detailed. Many of Germany's most modern factories had been financed with American money. The blueprints for those factories, submitted as a standard part of loan applications, were on file in New York banks. The planners studied the designs and deemed 154 sites crucial. Once those were destroyed, Arnold believed the Nazi war machine would grind to a halt. In order to avoid infighting with other services, AWPD-1 acknowledged other non-strategic missions for the Air Corps. It provided for close air support of ground troops and nodded occasionally to naval patrol. But in the minds of the airmen, bombing remained the Corps' sole true calling. On the other side of the ocean, the Nazis had come to exactly the opposite conclusion. Disarmed by the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not allowed to have an air force. After the Nazi ascent to power, however, Hermann Goering began to secretly build the Luftwaffe. The absolute captives of Blitzkrieg, the Luftwaffe became a force focused almost entirely on close air support, of paving the way for tactical movements on the ground. Japan, an island nation, focused almost entirely on naval aviation. They developed uniquely light and agile airframes well suited to operations off aircraft carriers. At the time of Pearl Harbor, their Zero was one of the finest fighter planes in the world. The greatest shortcoming of Japanese airplanners was in the lack of protection they afforded their pilots. Initially, Japanese pilots were discouraged from wearing parachutes. Their airframes were light and agile in large measure because they carried little or no armor. Accordingly, their reserve of skilled pilots quickly dwindled. Without a solid base of experienced manpower from which to draw, advances in aviation doctrine ground to a halt. Russia, a geographically enormous country, had a numerically enormous air force. But, like the Japanese, it lacked experienced leadership. Stalin had purged the Soviet military of all potential rivals. Among those were hundreds of pilots who had gained valuable combat experience in the Spanish Civil War. Stalin protected himself, but severely damaged his cause. So it was that the principal centers of tactical innovation during the war became the British and American bases in the European theater. There, air planners started out intoxicated by the possibilities of long-range bombers. They discounted the importance of fighters, believing that dogfighting would be a thing of the past at speeds over 300 miles per hour. The aircraft developers, however, didn't seem to agree. Dozens of fighters were developed during this period. Most were designed with air-to-air combat in mind, to reach and destroy the imagined armadas of enemy bombers and their escorts. The central British concerns for these interceptor aircraft were armament, maneuverability, and rate of climb. The principal British fighters, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire, were light and fast with a very short range. Since by the late 30s, the U.S. was shipping most of its warplanes to England, American fighters developed along parallel lines. But bombers remained the order of the day. Design and development money in both Britain and the United States went mostly to heavy bombers. The brass wanted 4-engine monstrosities capable of long flights at high altitude. These were the bedrock of strategic bombing, the American B-17s and British Wellingtons. To a lesser degree, both countries also developed medium and light bombers designed to perform lower-level, shorter-ranging missions. Bomber crews, believing themselves to be the great hope of their nations, looked down their noses at fighter pilots. In fact, training fighter pilots was made a lower priority than training bomber crews. Tactical thinking seemed almost perfunctory. In Britain, fighter pilots used the Vic, a tight V-shaped 3-plane formation. Squadrons practiced only a limited range of tactics, 6 different set-piece attacks against formations of bombers. This was their preparation for their first battles with the Luftwaffe. The Germans and Russians focused their efforts in a completely different direction. In the 1930s, both countries had fought in the Spanish Civil War. Experience there led them to reject many of the theories accepted as fact by the U.S. and Britain. Both Soviet and Nazi pilots knew that it was still possible to dogfight at high speeds, and that air superiority, not bombing, should be the first priority of any air force. As a result, both countries invested primarily in 2 types of aircraft, fighters and dive bombers. The fighters, conceived for dogfighting, were fast, maneuverable, and performed best at high altitudes. The ground attack aircraft were optimized for low-level flight, sacrificing agility for stability. Germany's air doctrine was wedded to the overall concept of blitzkrieg. Fast-moving panzer columns were preceded by fighters and Stuka dive bombers, which shrieked from the sky to blast enemy defenses and attack troop concentrations. From this arose a dedication to cooperation with the Army that in the end stunted development in other areas. In 1936, Goering discontinued development of a 4-engine heavy bomber. He needed the industrial capacity to convert the Ju-88 into dive bomber configuration. Other airframes were canceled or delayed as well, because Hitler thought strategic bombers to be little more than siege weapons. He was appalled to see millions of bombs pouring out of his factories and ordered the production to cease immediately. Blitzkrieg was, after all, lightning war. There was no need to plan for protracted fighting. As the war opened, it looked as if Hitler might be right. The suddenness and ferocity of Blitzkrieg lent a superhuman aura to an already imposing German force. The Poles were under-equipped to resist such an onslaught, as were the French. The Luftwaffe garnered a reputation for invulnerability. Its pilots and planes proved themselves the best in the world. The Luftwaffe seemed so superior that as the Nazis threatened to push the French army and the British Expeditionary Force into the sea, the RAF actually refused to help. Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command Hugh Dowding did not want to see his already limited resources depleted in France, which was almost certainly a lost cause. The Allies had little to do in the face of the German onslaught but retreat. The Luftwaffe and Panzer divisions pounded the ground forces all the way to the English Channel. In the skies above Dunkirk, the BEF finally got its air support. The RAF arrived just in time to help the Army slip back across the Channel. Goering, who had sworn to stop the evacuation, was incensed. It was the first indication that the irresistible Luftwaffe, now just 22 miles from England, could be challenged. With just a sliver of water standing between Britain and the Nazis, the Royal Air Force was now England's first line of defense. Thousands of Britons joined the Home Guard, an elaborate network that scanned the skies for approaching aircraft. The British also deployed the first working radar, all on the assumption that the Nazis' next move would be the bombardment of England's southern cities. That campaign was, in Hitler's plan, prelude to the eventual invasion of England, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. The Luftwaffe was to do basically what it had done in Poland and France, pave the way. But when the Germans finally launched their attack, the pilots of the Luftwaffe confronted for the first time a foe prepared to put up a fight. The greatest advantage the Germans had was experience. They had months or even years of actual combat behind them. The bulk of the English flyers had only their brief training. The British were quick studies, though, and rapidly abandoned the Vic formation in favor of the German Rota. Developed by the Condor Legion while fighting for Franco in Spain, the Rota was a loose formation of two planes, each pilot covering the other. It is, in fact, the wingman formation that remains at the heart of modern fighter doctrine. It allows pilots more freedom to improvise in the Vic while still maintaining security. Also helping to close the experience gap between the English and Germans was a simple fact of geography. The Battle of Britain was being fought over English soil. German crews that survived being shot down became prisoners of war, their knowledge and experience lost. British pilots parachuted to safety and returned to duty in short order, presumably better for the experience. The German planes were also out of their element over Britain. They had not been designed to conduct what amounted to a strategic campaign. The Me-109s and 110s that had seemed so remarkable flying cap for blitzing tank columns were sluggish compared to their British counterparts. Flying to Britain drained their tanks so that they could spend only 20 minutes in actual battle. When the fighters left, the bombers were alone, sitting ducks for the rapidly expanding corps of British aces. In the face of this stiff resistance, the Germans changed their tactics. Their solution was the same as it had been in World War I: terror bombing. Attempting to break the British will to fight, in August 1940, the Luftwaffe began nightly air raids over London. Relentless, deadly, and terrifying, this period of prolonged bombardment came to be known as the Blitz. Ultimately, this first application of strategic air power proved a failure. Londoners began sleeping in air raid shelters and subway tunnels. They packed their children off to the north, out of range of the Luftwaffe. Still, the results were horrific. Huge blocks of this city were destroyed, and by the time it ended in May 1941, 43,000 British civilians had been killed. After 4 months, the Germans knew that Operation Sea Lion would never take place. The Battle of Britain had been lost. England would not be conquered. With winter on the way, Hitler postponed the aerial campaign indefinitely. Britain's successful defense of the home island exposed the Luftwaffe's weaknesses and deflated its superhuman image. The lack of planning for a long-term war, insufficient numbers of long-range bombers and transports, and inadequate training had doomed the invasion of England. While the Luftwaffe may have been central to Blitzkrieg, it could not adjust to a more strategic role. At the same time, the RAF was gaining skill and confidence. In North Africa, it was able to recreate the successful formula from the Battle of Britain. The British established an early warning network and dispatched interceptors to meet incoming German fighters and bombers. In time, the RAF established air superiority, knocking German fighters out of the air at astounding rates. That done, the RAF easily assimilated 2 new offensive roles. First, it closed down the Nazi supply pipeline across the Mediterranean, a job that traditionally would have fallen to the Navy. Then, with the Germans suffering shortages of fuel, food, and ammunition, the RAF went to work on the famed Africa Corps. They created cab ranks, flights of aircraft loitering high above the battlefield, waiting to be hailed by ground forces in need of help. Those swift attacks proved devastating, strafing and bombing